Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood. I write fiction for fun and profit. Before we get to today's show, we have to do one thing real quick, and that's a little spot from our sponsor. Fortunately enough, our sponsor is me. In a world of valor and magic, two soldiers flee from their past. An isolated mountain town suffers under the heel of a vicious band of brigands. An offer of redemption for the one, salvation for the other, but not without great risk to both. Action and adventure await in Glimmer Vale, the first book of the Glimmer Vale Chronicles. Get your copy today, wherever great books are sold. Alright friends, it is Story Saturday! Yay! We are continuing with stories from last year's project that I wrote. Last year, I aimed to do at least a story a week, and we did that, crushed it, and we're reading those stories this year. Well, this year, right now, in fact. We are today reading a story called Fenri's Gambit. Now, Fenri's Gambit is a fantasy crime story that I wrote in conjunction with So I took a workshop on how to write fantasy capers last year, and culminating project on that was you had to build a fantasy world and a team, and write your caper. And I went a little overboard on that one because the story was supposed to be no more than 8,000 words because we're writing it in a short period of time. But I was so deeply into this thing that I had constructed that it basically turned into wrote the story itself. The caper ended up being a 12,000 word novelette, but I wrote a whole bunch of other stuff to, flesh out characters and things. And then afterwards, I wrote some other stories with some of the characters from that caper team because I liked them. And this one isn't about one of the team members, but it's basically a scene that I didn't put in the final novelette that I turned in, but it's explaining how they got some of their data and how it affects a different person who has having some trouble. And you'll see it. It's fun. I should probably be doing this discussion for afterwards, but doesn't matter because I wrote it. I like it. It's awesome. You're gonna like it because I wrote it, and it's awesome. And I'm gonna read it to you, and we'll talk more about it on the back end. So sit back and enjoy. A gentle breeze, blown lightly from the south, carried with it the scent of pollen and the hint of wood smoke. Barely perceptible, it nevertheless carried a bit of a respite, just a bit, from the growing heat of the day, and Fenri wished it would blow a bit stronger. From atop his post, on the southeast tower of Marilon, he was above the mass of people thronging through the city's streets and making an already hot day into a roasting oven from the close confines and the extra warmth of bodies. But he had on mail and leathers, and was loaded down by a sword on his left hip, a spear in his right hand, and a shield on his left forearm. The leather padding on the inside of the helmet atop his head was soaked, and he felt the sweat running down the back of his neck to further wet the tunic he wore beneath his armor. So yes, he was above the worst of it, but even here it was only just south of miserable, so he mentally clung to that breeze like a drowning man to a lifeline. Fenri rolled his shoulders as best he could beneath the load of his gear and forced his eyes away from the thronging masses in the east quarter below and behind his post. He really needed to be looking out, anyway. That was the purpose of his post, after all. The sun was nearing its zenith, so his relief would be coming up to him soon at least. That was something. Not that there was really much to look out for. To the east of the city, the river ran north to south within a quarter-mile of the walls, and that area had been completely cleared of trees. The city docks lay to his left, and upriver a mile or so distant, a sprawling expanse of warehouses and finger piers that attracted the trade coming up and down the river from Wallandia's settlements along the water's flow. He could see half a dozen river scows, those running downstream with sails furled, going with the current and the occasional oar, those tacking upstream on the fitful breeze seeming to stand still by comparison. On the far side of the river, the forest that dominated this part of the country was more present, though it had been mostly tamed. As far as the eye could see, the terrain was rolling hills and the patchwork of tilled farmlands, with clusters of what remained of the once expansive forest broken into smaller clumps of bushy green. A couple lords' manors houses were visible, the associated hamlets sprawling nearby, and the activity of farmer and merchant making their way across the countryside was easily detectable, even to the naked eye. This was all territory fully under the control of the King of Wallandia, safe and prosperous. No invader had come near Marlan in almost 100 years, and armed civil strife had been all but unheard of in nearly half of that. Not for the first time in this shift, and for countless times over all the shifts he'd stood up here, Fenri wondered what was he actually supposed to be looking out for. Behind him, the sound of wood scraping against stone stated that the trapdoor leading down into the uppermost level of the watchtower was opening. Fenri looked away from the rather picturesque, actually, landscape to the east, toward a sundial that was mounted halfway along the eastern side of the battlements upon which he was stationed, and found himself smiling in a mixture of relief and satisfaction. It was dead on noon, and as always, Samuel was right on time relieving him. Fenri didn't need to look back to know it was him. Samuel always grunted and huffed as he hoisted himself up the ladder in the same way, with the same curse that he only ever voiced under his breath, so that the one maybe would not hear it, from his throne up in heaven. Not that Henry objected to Samuel's faith in the deity, not at all, he shared it, but sometimes Samuel took his outward signs of piety to silly extremes. Like the creator of all things didn't know that men, especially fighting men, expressed themselves in earthy ways, and like he would actually object to it. Fenri was careful to wipe the amusement from his face when Samuel stepped up next to him, though. No need to stir that pot. Samuel was a bit taller than Fenri, but also more stout. His belly struggled against the breastplate that all of the king's guards wore when on duty, and though Fenri knew from hard experience in the sparring ring that he had the endurance of an ox, that still brought Samuel teasing comments from some of the newer guardsmen. But only once. Samuel's sharp brown eyes swept the landscape below and before them, and then he turned to look at Fenri with a friendly but professional expression on his round face. "Any trouble this morning?" Fenri snorted. "Just the usual silliness at the east gate." He held out the spear toward Samuel, and he accepted it. Then Fenri, with a feeling of relief, got to work on the shield. "Can't wait till we stop all this silliness," he said as he loosened the straps holding the heavy piece of metal and wood to his forearm. "Like we're ever going to stab anyone from way up here." Samuel's gaze became disapproving for a moment, but then just as quickly turned commiserating. "It's the 200th anniversary. Gotta look good." Yeah, Fenri said, and let out a sigh of relief when he was finally able to get the damn thing off his arm. He lowered it down so it was resting against the crenellations in front of him, but you'd think someone would have told the prefect. Samuel shrugged, and that carried more agreement than anything else. Normally, watchstanders up on the towers carried bows, which made sense, and in fact there was a trio of unstrung bows tucked away in the northeast corner of the parapet, along with 2 barrels full of arrows. What else would the guard use to repel an attacker from up on the top of the tower? But it was the anniversary of the kingdom's unification, so all the guardsmen on duty everywhere in the city had to wear their full-dress uniforms with spear and shield and sword, and the one help a man if everything wasn't polished to a mirror shine when one of the officers came around for inspection. And to hell with practicality. The prefect had come up through the ranks before being raised to the level of a minor duchy under Lord Hampstead on account of his performance in the battle 10 years ago, so he knew the travails of the common soldier. You'd think a man like that would be able to deflect at least the smelliest of offal running downhill from the pampered princes who call the shots these days, but apparently not. Thankfully, the anniversary celebration would be over in another week, and then things get back to at least a semblance of sanity. "Anyway, it looks like a quiet afternoon for you," Fenri said, stepping back from where he had left the shield. Samuel nodded. He moved to take up the shield, but stopped mid-step and looked back at Fenri. "Your wife sent a note," he said, and raised an eyebrow at him. "Sergeant of the Watch has it for you." Fenri's spirits, which had been beginning to rise from finally having been relieved of the watch, stopped their ascent and stared warily at him as he considered Samuel's words. Did she deliver it herself? Samuel shook his head. It was her sister. Fenri let out a groan, and Samuel broke away from any semblance of military bearing to give him a sympathetic half-smile. So much for a quiet afternoon post-watch. The note wasn't what he expected. He was standing in the Sergeant of the Watch's office at the base of the watchtower. The sergeant was a grizzled old veteran of a dozen foreign wars, 11 more than Fenri had seen, with graying hair that used to be charcoal black but had receded until it was just a rim around his head just above his ears and had only a few strands of its original color. His eyes were gray and hard as stone, matching the deep crevices in his face, more frown lines than smiles, and the embroidered knots of rank on the pauldrons on his shoulders. He handed over the note, sealed with unemblazoned wax and tied with a short gray ribbon around the roll of parchment on which it was written, without a word when Fenri reported to ask for it. The sergeant didn't have to say anything. He'd said it enough during pre-watch briefings for the last 2 years since he took over the southeast tower. When his men were on duty, they were on duty. He didn't begrudge a man taking care of his family, but he expected each man to take care of his business in such a way that it didn't impinge on his duty during his time of watch. Getting outside messages except in emergency, well, the sergeant frowned on that. Fenri looked up from the parchment and found the sergeant's eyes burrowing into him, accusingly, screaming, "Why are you unable to not screw up my watch rotation, soldier?" Sotto voce. Fenri put on a smile that he hoped was placating, though the way his heart was pounding from reading the note, he wasn't so sure, and he said, "Our boy got into a tussle with some of the local toughs. He got the best of one, but the other two—" He shrugged his shoulders. The sergeant's expression eased a bit. "Is he all right?" Fenri nodded. "A black eye and a couple scrapes." He swallowed and let out a half-laugh. "Nothing serious. She just didn't want me to be surprised when I got home." Silence for a few seconds, then the sergeant nodded. If anything, he looked approving. "Good for him." He paused, then grunted. "Too many kids these days don't know how to stand up for themselves." He nodded toward the door in dismissal. "Tell him good job from me." Fenri nodded quickly. "I will." Then he hurriedly left the sergeant's office. When the heavy wooden door shut behind him, he let out an explosive breath and slumped against the hard stone of the tower's wall, cold despite the oppressive heat outside in the city. Then he looked back at the note again. It did indeed tell of his oldest boy getting into a fight. But from the telling of it, he knew that fight had occurred 6 months ago, not today, and Kelsey hadn't sent a note about it then. He would have wondered what was going on, if not for the script in a hand not her own, scrawled beneath her account in sharp pen, that promised retribution through the very way it spelled out the letters of its message. Payment is overdue. Tomorrow at noon. Or he will get worse was the threat not written, because Fenri knew the hand that had written the final missive. Jorvin, Billy Gespin's head enforcer, the collector of all his debts. Fenri wanted to scream out a curse, but he dared not. If anyone knew how deep he had gotten himself with Gespin, especially the sergeant, he had known not to get involved with Gespin, no matter how Kelsey spent them into pauperdom. Better living in a shanty in the East Quarter, when he should have been able to afford a new place in the South Quarter on his guardsman pay. Better that by far than get into debt with the likes of him. But circumstances had piled up one after another, and then Devi got into his fight. It hadn't been just bumps and bruises, and they hadn't been in the right. Fenri couldn't ask the guard for help paying for his son's healing. How to tell them that he had been injured trying to rob a man? That would have sent Devi to the cells, if not worse. Devi wasn't a bad kid, he had just fallen in with some bad people. He learned his lesson, was going to turn things around, and he would never see those bad influences again. Fenri had seen to that. But he still required healing, and that was more than Fenri could pay with the way Kelsey spent. He had nowhere else to turn, so what if Gespin charged 10% a month? If he and Kelsey tightened their belts, Fenri could pay him back in 4 months, easy. Except Kelsey hadn't tightened her belt at all. It had been 6 months now, and Gespin was getting impatient. Pushing himself off the wall, Fenri hurried away from the sergeant's office, toward the squad room at the other side of the tower's ground floor. He had to keep his cool through the rest of his shift. Keep his cool and not let on that he was in trouble. Then this evening, maybe he could figure a way out of this. Fenri hurried away from the watchtower at the end of his shift without bothering to clean up. He left his breastplate, helmet, gauntlets, and other bits of guardsman's kit in the armory, but he kept his tunic and leggings, despite the fact that they had been completely soaked in his own sweat earlier. The watchtower had serving personnel who would see to cleaning his clothing that he used during duty times, so he usually didn't leave in his dirty and smelly garments at the end of a watch. A lot of the time he would come to his shift in a shirt and leggings that he owned and leave them in the equipment room, changing out once he was done with his duty. But today he didn't have time for that. He just turned in his gear to the armorer and left. In reality, he probably did have time. Not like an extra few minutes to change would bother Gespin one way or the other. But since the top of the note was in Kelsey's hand, he had to know that she was okay first and foremost, so he just dumped his issued equipment and left. More like fled. The watchtower was at the southeast corner of Marilon, along the boundary between the poor east quarter and the better-off south quarter. The street that ran northwest from the tower was a dialogue in contradictions. To the right along the street, in the east quarter, the streets were narrow, the buildings all wooden, with overhanging second floors that left only a narrow passageway between them that would ever see the sun. Passageways that offered just enough room for a couple of carts to pass each other, going opposite directions. People walked on the sides of the street, beneath the overhangs or directly below the windows there. Residents typically threw trash and chamber pots out the upstairs windows, so a walker had to pay attention to avoid getting splattered in filth while traversing the quarter, which had a distinct odor to it that everyone in the city recognized and abhorred. The south quarter, on the other hand, had streets that were a bit more broad, buildings that were a mix of wood and stone, and though many had overhanging upper levels, the threat of dumping from above was much reduced because the quarter also had extensive alleys, and the residents tended to dump trash and waste into receptacles in those alleys. City crews would roam through those alleys to remove the detritus regularly, so the south quarter also lacked the odor of the east. Not that the same city crews didn't try to clean up the east quarter. It was simply less possible considering the overall layout and the press of people continually traversing the area. When he joined the guard, Fenri envisioned getting a small, respectable flat in the south quarter. Maybe, if he got promoted, a house unto itself. A not unattainable goal for a guardsman who kept his nose clean and was wise with his money. Except Kelsey had an irrepressible appetite for finer things than he could afford to pay on his salary. He shoved the thought from his head as he turned right and slid into the line of people moving deeper into the east quarter from the dividing street. No sense getting angry with her. If he was honest with himself, he knew he had contributed to their financial woes as well, perhaps equally as much as her. Well, he wouldn't go that far, not even out of charity. Regardless, casting blame wouldn't solve the issue he found himself in now. Less than a full day to make his payment to Gespin, and did he even have the money to do so? They had missed last month's payment, but he would get paid again at the end of the week. That would make accounts square with Gespin for now, but it would mean going without any money for living expenses until his next payment from the guard in a fortnight. Could they survive that? Fenri wasn't sure, but was there any choice? If he didn't pay, a man moved up alongside him on his left, nudging against Fenri's shoulders, and he stumbled to the right, bumping into an elderly woman who had been walking next to him. She let out a curt "hey" as she stumbled onto the side of the low-end tailor shop they were walking past. Fenri collected himself and reached out to help the woman get back to her feet. "I'm sorry." Then he felt something sharp and pointy pressing into his side just above his left hip, and a man's voice said, "Keep moving," into his ear. He tensed, fight or flight rearing up within him, as he began processing the techniques that years of martial training had honed into him. The pointing object, certainly a dagger, pressed in more firmly, and Fenri wondered if it hadn't cut through his tunic and begun to draw blood. "Don't try it," said the man, who had reached up to clutch his left shoulder with his free hand, even as he was driving the dagger up against, and maybe into, Fenri's side. He was dark of hair and eye, his face framed by a long, curly beard. He wore a green tabard and a similarly colored cloak that must have been hell in this heat, but it did conceal what he was doing with the dagger from the other people present, so Fenri considered it must be worth it. The man was of a height with him, but more lean, and his eyes were hard as the sergeant's, but in a different way. The sergeant had seen battles by the dozen, and his hardness came from the surety that discipline was the way to ensure as many of his men survived the battle as possible while attaining victory. This man's eyes said he had killed more people than the sergeant had ever dreamed, and he wouldn't hesitate to do the same to Fenri, right here, right now, and to hell with the witnesses. Any thought of fighting back fled. Even if the dagger hadn't been positioned so the man could thrust it into his innards before he could try anything, Fenri wasn't certain his skills, intended for the disciplined battlefield, would be equal to this man's, intended for the wild streets. And anyway, was he one of Gaspin's men? If so, Fenri didn't dare to fight back, because what would come of Kelsey and their sons if he did, and lost? Or even if he won? All that flashed through Fenri's head in an instant, and he nodded. Then, leaving the woman who was in the middle of getting herself back up onto her feet behind, he continued forward, at pace with this strange, dark, menacing man. At the man's nudging and occasional tersely worded directions, he turned off the street he was walking to the right, then turned left, right, left, then left again until he was in a portion of the east quarter that he did not know. Best he could reckon he was nearing the east gate, but where exactly he was in the warren of passages through this part of the city, he wasn't entirely sure. Part of him felt ashamed. True, he didn't want to live in this section of the city, but he did. Surely he should know his way around better than to get lost so easily here. Just as quickly as it came, he thrust that shame down. The east quarter was almost literally a warren, and despite its name made up almost a third of Maryland's total area. A huge space, and no one could hope to know it all, and he and Kelsey had a place along the edges of the quarter, as close to the better areas as he could afford considering their circumstances. When they ventured out, it was to the south quarter, not to the inner recesses of the east. Look toward the goal, not the present. That's what his father had always told him, and he had. But now Fenri wished he had taken the time to learn the area better. It might help him make his escape, if he had an opportunity for one. Which it didn't look like he would, as the dark man pulled him to a stop in front of a dilapidated-looking two-story building. One of its front windows was obviously broken and covered by a pair of weather-stained boards. The other was dark, a curtain of some sort drawn within to keep passers-by from looking inside. The front door was nondescript. It might once have been blue, but now it was faded to gray. A placard over the door merely read, "In," like the building didn't need any name other than that. Inside, third room on the left. The man nudged Henry with the dagger, and he moved forward obediently. The inside was dim. Whatever light may have come in from the front windows was muted to near non-existence by the boards and the carefully drawn curtains. Tallow candles in sconces on either side of the door on the inner wall behind the short counter off to the right provided the only light. The place wasn't badly decorated, just simply. A black fur rug on the floor muffled their steps on the way in, and there was a simple painting of a setting sun over a still lake, simple and obviously not very skilled from the brushwork, on the wall opposite the counter. The place smelled musty, like it hadn't been swept in a while, but it was neatly kept up, nothing strewn about that Fenri could see. A middle-aged woman in a simple blue dress, her graying hair pulled back from her face by a brighter blue headband, glanced up from her position behind the counter as they walked in. For a second it appeared she was going to greet Fenri, but then her eyes alighted on the dark man and they widened for a heartbeat. Then she resolutely looked away from them, back down to a leather-bound ledger that was open on the counter in front of her. The man nudged him again, and Fenri proceeded past her counter into a hallway leading back into the bowels of the inn, or whatever this was. As he went, he saw her glance back up at him ever so slightly, then just as quickly look back down. The third door on the left opened immediately when the man guiding Fenri knocked on it, and he guided Fenri inside. It was a bedroom, like this was an actual inn, for a wonder. Less than fancy, the lone bed was an obviously straw-stuffed mattress against the far wall, sized for a single body, and standing on four simple legs with a gray wool blanket thrown atop the mattress. A wash basin and two-drawered cabinet stood at the foot of the bed, and that was it for furniture. The room was filled to overflowing by a bald-headed, mustached, muscular man in a black tunic that looked to have been well-spun linen, flanking a smaller, leaner fellow in blue that looked like it could have been silk, it shimmered so. The muscle man had a long dagger, very nearly a sword, on his belt, and he had his arms crossed over his chest in a relaxed pose that nonetheless promised violence in a heartbeat. The blue-shirted man was younger, with well-trimmed blonde hair that looked like it had been enchanted to flow in a manner that would make him seem dashing, like a breeze was blowing it despite there being not even a hint of moving air in the room. He stood at his ease like nothing in the world could give him pause. When Fenri walked in, the man's blue eyes flicked up and down him in a heartbeat, and Fenri felt like he had taken his entire measure in that instant. The difference between the two men was so profound that at first Fenri didn't even notice the lithe, dark-skinned woman leaning up against the far corner. She was dressed in a red blouse and tight-fitting black leggings, and like the muscle man, she had her arms crossed over her chest. But whereas he looked like relaxation ready for violence, she just looked relaxed. Her black hair was cut short to her shoulders, and her dark brown eyes watched him in silent appraisal. There was little room to maneuver in the room, but the man who had been guiding Fenri nudged him forward anyway. "Sit down," he said. And for a second Fenri wasn't sure what he meant. There were no chairs, of course. Sighing, Fenri took a short step forward, then turned and sat on the mattress. It was just as lumpy as he imagined it would be, and bits of the stuffing poked through the thin fabric holding it together into his thighs and buttocks. He didn't let his discomfort with that, or with the situation as a whole, show. Or at least he tried not to. Instead, he drew a breath and said in as even a tone as he could, "Look, Gespin said I had until tomorrow. Why?" The blond man cut him off. "We're not from Gespin, Fenri." Fenri blinked, confusion welling up within him. Who are you then?" "You were part of the guard detail that accompanied the Chancellor to Lord Dealey's townhouse to get his items for the anniversary display in the old keep." That was the woman leaning against the wall. Fenri looked over at her and found her expression neutral, implacable. What was going on here? What do you people want?" "You went with the Chancellor down into Dealey's vault," the blond man said. "You saw what precautions he's laid there." Fenri shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about. The dagger-wielding man stepped up closer, the knife that had been poking into Fenri's side the whole time on the streets clearly visible. It was 1.5 feet long if it was an inch. The blade was serpentine, swaying back and forth into a fine tip that had probably seen hundreds of hearts in its day. And was he imagining things, or was its tip already slightly red? Had it drawn his blood already? Fenri's hand went to his side where the weapon had poked him before, but before he could look down at it, the blond man spoke again. "Relax, Fenri. We don't want to hurt you." "We want to help you." Fenri looked back at him and snorted, loudly. The blond man looked to his right toward the muscular man and nodded to him. The muscular man made a long, languid roll of his shoulders, then uncrossed his arms. His left hand went to his belt, where a bulging pouch Fenri hadn't noticed before hung. A moment later, the pouch sailed through the air to land next to Fenri on the mattress. His jaw dropped open, and he looked from the pouch to the muscle man to the blond man in confusion. "Open it," the blond man said. Fenri did so, and he only thought his jaw had dropped before. The pouch was full of silver. Half a year's pay at least. Maybe an entire year's worth. "That should square you with Gespin," said the blond man, drawing Fenri's eyes back to himself. "Plus a bit extra for your trouble." "How do you know about that? Do you really care?" asked the woman. Fenri didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the blond man. He was obviously running the show. The man just looked at him with a frank, apparently unguarded expression, one that seemed to be genuinely friendly, interested in Fenri's well-being. "Like hell. What do you want for—" He gestured toward the bag. "Like I said," the blond man said, "you were in Dealey's place. You saw his vault. Tell us everything you saw there." He gestured toward the pouch. "Then you're free to go." "With the money," he didn't say. He didn't have to. Fenri glanced back at the dagger-wielding man. He didn't need to ask what would happen if he didn't give the blond man what he was looking for. And he could do it. Fenri had been happy to be on that detail. Easy duty, escorting one lord to meet with another and bring a fancy thing back to the old keep. It certainly beat standing a boring watch atop a watchtower, and he'd never seen the inside of a High Lord's dwelling before. He'd told tales about it to his friends for days over tankards at the local tavern. It had made his week. Fenri didn't have to ask how this man and his compatriots had found him. Inwardly, he kicked himself for being so careless, for letting his tongue wag the way he had. And yet... He looked back at the pouch, seemingly overflowing with coins. With that much, he could get clear of all of his debts. Maybe get that place in the South Quarter he'd wanted for so long. Get away from the filth and the smell and the shady neighbors in the East Quarter. He licked his lips with a tongue that was completely dry, because how could he know the blond man was telling the truth? And he wouldn't just have Dagger Man skewer him after getting what he wanted. "I have a wife. Sons." Fenrir hadn't meant to say it. He had intended something witty, or at least not pathetic. "So much for that." "We know, Fenri," said the woman. "No reason you can't take them to a nice dinner tonight." He glanced over at her and she nodded. Then he looked at the Dagger Man and the Muscle Man, at their blank, implacable expressions. Then finally at the blond man, who wore an expression that was almost friendly. And somehow that didn't seem fake. Fenri sighed, then he nodded. Kelsey had never experienced the kind of meal that Fenri took her and their sons to that night. They went to a high-end place in the central area of the South Quarter, right up against the boundary with the inner city, where the nobles and the merchants rubbed noses with each other. Fenri had been feasted by a lord once, along with his company at the end of his one war campaign 5 years ago. It beat this meal for sheer size and quality, but somehow this one was better. Partly it was from relief at having survived the encounter in that nameless inn, partly from giddiness over the newfound wealth he had come into, and that the blond man had actually let him walk away with it. But mostly it was because he was with his family, smiling faces that for a brief moment on that horrible mattress he had thought he would never see again. He never thought to feel guilt over spilling Lord Dealey's secret. Probably the blond man and his crew intended to rob him, but why should Fenri care? He'd sworn no oath to that pompous ass, and anyway Dealey and his family had been living off the backs of others for so long, maybe they deserved to be taken down a peg or 6. So he raised his mug, filled with a very good wine, to his wife over the nicest dinner table they had ever sat at together, and he smiled broadly. He was free, and he was going to make the most of it. And from her returning smile, she was right there with him, and always would be. That was reason enough to feel good about his meeting in that inn. "Good luck, Blondie," he said inwardly. "Good luck." Okay, so Fenri's hooked up, and those mysterious people got the information they needed. You will no doubt guess that those mysterious people are some of the team from the caper that I mentioned at the beginning. I have not yet released that final version of that story to the public at large because I have been submitted it to a couple places and waiting to hear back from them. But that'll be released. But in the meantime, this is sort of a tangential thing, which hopefully you dug, and you'll come back for more when that comes around. But, and not just for that, but for other stories from Volume 3 of last year's project. Next week, we're going to get into the next story, which is called Lights Out, Shipmate. And this is back to military sci-fi, back to the Confederation Navy, and so this setting and in place that you will be familiar with from 3 out of the last 4 stories. So that'll be fun. And as the title implies, it's a little more lighthearted. Or is it? I guess we'll see. But yeah, so we're going to call it quits here for Story Saturday. Hope you liked that story. If you did, make sure that you have, of course, that you like this. If you've already subscribed to this channel or podcast or whatever you're listening to it on, and you've already done that, then you are doing right. If you have not yet done that, you are doing wrong, and you should be subscribed. You should also go seek out and buy more books written by me, because the whole purpose of this channel is to tell people how to buy books, so they can buy them and I can make money. So, michaelkingswood.com/store is the best place, because that's my company store, maximum profit. michaelkingswood.com/books to read. The number 2 will get you to a link aggregator that you can pick out the title, and it'll tell you all the stores it's available on that are not mine, and you can go get them there. We're also doing the Substack. Don't forget that. Paralleling these stories, you can read this instead of listening to it, or read other stories over at michaelkingswood.substack.com. You can subscribe there and read stuff. You can also do a paid subscription there to help, show your support for the things that we're doing around here. Alternate ways to show monetary support is over on the Subscribe Star page, and obviously buying books, sending crypto, doing all kinds of good stuff. I think, so that's all the pimpage I've got for now. I'm going to head off now. We'll be back next week for Story Saturday, of course, but of course we do Music Mondays now, and we do game streaming, because it hit me that if I'm doing this channel, streaming games could be considered business. So it gives me an excuse to play all those games that I let fall onto the back burner. And of course, when I'm not writing the next thing. But you know what I mean. So come back for that. I'll see you then. Till then, don't do anything I wouldn't do.